Okay, now we'll share our screen. While we're sharing the screen, we'll say the blessing that we make before we learn Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al divrei Torah. Okay. So when it coming to the laws reciting the laws regarding reciting the blessing over fire on Saturday night, we learned extensively last week that if the fire belongs to a non-Jew, meaning if the fire was lit on Shabbat, then you're not allowed to use that for the blessing after Shabbat. It has to be a fire that has not done any prohibited work on the Shabbat. So, what do you have to actually strike that match in front of you, or are you, if you're driving on the highway and you see the fire of the lights coming from the city, are you able to make that blessing, or do you have to actually see the light itself? Continues the Gemara, the sages taught in a brisa, if one was walking outside the city and he saw fire there and wanted to recite the blessing over the fire as part of Havdalah. So, if the city has a majority of Gentiles, he may not recite the blessing over the fire. But if the city has a majority of Jews, he may recite the blessing. So now the Gemara is going to ask this question, but asks it in a funny way. The Gemara notes, the matter itself is difficult in this brisa. It's a contradiction within itself. You said in the brisa that if the town has a majority of Gentiles, he may not recite the blessing. By inference, if the town population was half Gentiles and half Jew, what's going to be the law?
You can recite the blessing.
You could recite the blessing. And then in the end of that same brisa, it says, and then you teach that if the town has a majority of Jews, he may recite the blessing. Which means that if the town is half Jew and half Gentile, then
It's not clear because it just says the town population was half and half. You could recite a blessing.
so 1 second. We said, let's give a quick recap for Good Morning Zaman and Good Morning Chaim. So the Brisa said if the city is more Jews, then you could use the fire. If the city is majority Gentiles, then you cannot use the fire. So if the city is if based on the beginning section, I said them out of order now. The first part of the Mishnah was the Brisa was if the town is a majority of Gentiles, you may not recite the blessing. We may infer from that if the city is half Jew and half Gentile, what would be the law?
You may recite a blessing.
You may recite the blessing. But then from the second half of this brisa, the second half says that if the place is majority of Jews, then you can recite the blessing. Means that if it's half and half, if I tell you that if the city has the majority of Jews, you are allowed to use the fire, then in a scenario where the town has only half Jews, what would be the law?
And not use it.
You may not. So what's going on? From the beginning of the brisa, it seems that if the city is half and half, you could use it. From the end of the brisa, it seems that if the city is half and half, you cannot use it. So if the city is half Jew and half Gentile, are you allowed to use that light or are you not? Good question. I'm going to take it that everyone agrees it's a good question.
It's a good question.
Thank you. The Gemara responds by right. The Brisa should have taught that even if the town population was half Gentiles and half Jews, one may recite the blessing. So it should have said, really, it should have said, if the majority of Gentiles, if the majority of the town are Gentiles, you may not use the fire. But if even half of the city is Jewish, then you could use the fire. But since in the first clause it taught the majority of Gentiles, the Mishnah likes to stay, loves conformity, and the Brisa loves conformity. We love to use the same expressions to employ the same verbiage whenever we can. Therefore, it says the majority of Gentiles in the beginning. So in the latter clause, it used the same expression and taught the majority of Jews. And the sages taught one who was walking outside the city at the conclusion of Shabbat and saw a child with a torch in his hand. He must check after his background. If a child is a Jew, he may recite the blessing over this flame, but if the child is a Gentile, he may not recite a blessing over it. The Gemara asks a very simple question: why only a child? If you were an adult, you would also need to investigate whether he was Jew or Gentile in order to determine whether you may or may not recite a blessing over his torch. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, we're dealing with a case where, even though Shabbat had ended, it was very soon after sunset. Therefore, in the case of an adult, it is self-evident that he is a Gentile, because a Jew would not be so quick to take fire in his hand immediately after Shabbat. In the case of a child, however, you could say that he is a Jew, and it happened that kids take torches. No? Kids don't take torches? Of course kids take torches and run around with them. And the sages taught one who was walking outside the city at the conclusion of Shabbat and saw a fire. If the fire is at least as thick as the opening of a furnace, one may recite a blessing over it, as a fire of that size is kindled for the light it produces as well. And if it is not at least that thick, one may not recite a blessing over it, because that fire would not be for light, that fire would just be for heat. It was taught in one brisa, during Havdalah, one may recite a blessing over the fire of a furnace, and in another brisa it says you may not recite the blessing over a furnace, which is a contradiction. The Gemara responds, this is not a big problem. This is not difficult, because this brisa, which says that you're not allowed to use it for the blessing, is talking about the beginning, when the furnace was just kindled and the fire is designated solely to heat the objects in the furnace. And that brisa, which permits reciting the blessing, is talking at the end, when the fire is no longer needed to heat the objects in the furnace, and its light is now used for other purposes. The Gemara cites a similar contradiction between brises. It was taught in one brisa that during Havdalah one may recite the blessing over the fire of an oven or a stove, and it was taught in another brisa one may not recite a blessing over the oven or a stove. And the Gemara responds, this is not difficult, as a similar distinction between the brises may be suggested. This brisa that prohibits reciting the blessing is in the beginning, when the oven or stove was just kindled and the fire is designated solely to heat the objects on the stove or in the oven. And that brisa which permits reciting the blessing is talking at the end, when the fire is no longer needed to heat the objects on the stove or in the oven, and its light is used for other purposes. Another contradiction. It was taught in one brisa, during Havdalah one may recite a blessing over the light of a synagogue or study hall. And it was taught in another brisa, one may not recite a blessing over a study hall or a synagogue. And the Gemara responds, this is not difficult, because this brisa which prohibits reciting the blessing is speaking in a case where there is an important person in the synagogue, and the fire is kindled in his honor, not to provide light. And that brisa which permits reciting the blessing is speaking in a case where there is no important person present and the fire is kindled to provide light. I guess in the olden days they would light candelabras for important people, not for light. There's another way to resolve this apparent contradiction, which is, if you wish, you could say instead that this brisa and that brisa are talking about a case where there is an important person present in the synagogue. And it is still not difficult, because the contradiction can be resolved as follows. This brisa, which permits reciting the blessing, is speaking in a case where there is a caretaker in the synagogue who uses the light. And that brisa which prohibits reciting the blessing is speaking in a case where there is no caretaker, and therefore the light was kindled for purposes of honor, not for purposes of light. Now, I'm just trying to figure out how you could have a synagogue with Friday night services where how are they going to read from their prayer books if there is no light? Maybe we're talking in the time before prayer books where everyone was praying off by heart. I'm not sure. And if you wish, say instead, it depends what time of the month it was. This brisa and that brisa are both referring to a case where there is a caretaker present in the synagogue, and it's still not difficult because the contradiction can be resolved as follows. Sorry. The brisa which prohibits reciting the blessing is speaking in a case where there is moonlight, so the caretaker did not light the fire to provide light, as the moonlight is sufficient. And that brisa, which permits reciting the blessing, is speaking in a case where there is no moonlight and the caretaker lights the fire to provide light.
The fire is inside the synagogue, so the moonlight doesn't do anything, assuming that the synagogue has a roof.
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that question. Could be that on a day of the full moon, there was enough light coming in through the windows. I don't know. The sages taught in a brisa, people were seated in the study hall and they brought the fire before them at the conclusion of Shabbat. Beis Shammai say, each and every individual recites a blessing for himself, and Beis Hillel say, one recites a blessing on behalf of everyone and everyone else says, Amen. Beis Hillel's reasoning is, as the verse says, this is a verse that we're going to get to many, many times. The splendor of the king is in the multitude of people. When everyone joins together to hear the same blessing, the name of God is glorified. So we want to have the most people, whenever we can, joining in to the singular blessing that's made by the person who's making Havdalah, and everyone else says Amen. Okay, the Gemara asks, granted, Beis Hillel, they explain their reasoning, but what is the reason for the opinion of Beit Shammai to prohibit reciting the blessing communally? And the Gemara answers, they hold that is prohibited due to suspension of study in the study hall. Waiting for someone to recite the blessing will interrupt Torah study for several minutes. If you want everyone to be quiet, if you want to get the whole crowd to be quiet so that this one person can say the blessing, then you have to wait for everyone to get quiet. Then everyone has to concentrate and hear his blessing and recite Amen. However, if you have one kid running around with the torch up and back through the study hall, everyone can just look at the fire, make their blessing. It takes only a short moment, and then you go back to your study. This concern for disrupting Torah study was also taught in a brisa. The members of the house of Rabban Gamliel would not say Gesundheit when someone sneezed in the study hall, due to the fact that it would lead to suspension of study in the study hall. Okay, and that concludes our discussion over the fire in Havdalah. We learned in the Mishnah, one may neither recite a blessing over the candle nor over the spices designated to honor the dead. The Gemara explains what is the reason. Because the candle of the dead is kindled for the purpose of honoring the dead, not for light, and the spices are to neutralize the bad odor, not for their pleasant fragrance. And Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, any deceased before whom a candle is taken out both by day and by night, it is evident that the candle is for the purpose of honoring the deceased, and therefore one may not recite a blessing over it. Similar to the Shiva candle that we might have inside our houses, those are lit for honor, not for light. It is evident that the purpose of the candle is for its, and any deceased before whom a candle is taken out only at nighttime, it is evident that the purpose of the candle is for its light alone, and one may recite a blessing over it. Similarly, Rav Huna said over spices used to deodorize the bathroom and fragrant oil intended to remove filth, would be deodorant. One may not recite a blessing as they are not used for their pleasant fragrance, they are used for the removal of other bad smells. The Gemara asks, is that to say that any case where it's not being used for its pleasant fragrance, one may not recite a blessing over it? The Gemara raises an objection based on the Tosefta. If somebody goes into a perfume store and smelled a fragrance, does he have to make a blessing on it or not? Even if he sat there throughout the entire day, he recites a blessing only once. However, if he comes in and out of the store, he recites a blessing every time he comes in. But isn't this the case? The spices are not there for fragrance. They're not there to improve the scent in the store. Yet, we recite a blessing. Does anybody have an answer for me? Why does this guy have to make a blessing on the spices if the perfume and good smell is not there to improve the smell of the store, but he still has to make a blessing on it?
Because he exited.
That's why he has to make a new blessing every time. But
Right.
didn't we just learned that if any time that perfume is there, but it's not there for its pleasant smell, it's there for any other reason, then you don't make a blessing on that. So let's look at the Gemara's answer. The Gemara says, yes, of course. The spices are intended for fragrance. They're used to generate a scent in the store so people will come in and purchase. You know, the reason why he has the perfume containers open is so that people should smell the smell from outside and then come in and purchase them. Okay. The sages taught in the Brisa one who was walking outside a city and smelled a smell. If the majority of the town's residents are Gentiles, he may not recite a blessing over the scent, but if the majority are Jews, he may recite the blessing. Rabbi Yossi says, even if the majority are Jews, one may not recite the blessing, as the daughters of Israel burn incense to witchcraft, and the spices were certainly made for witchcraft, not for their fragrance. Oh boy. Okay. That is a stark accusation, isn't it? The Gemara asks, 1 second. You telling me that all of the Jewish women are burning incense to witchcraft? Rather, there is a minority of people who burn incense to witchcraft, and a different minority who burn spices in order to perfume their garments with incense. A majority therefore exists that does not use it for fragrance. Because even the Jews who are using it for fragrance, right? So we have a minority of Gentiles, and we have a majority of Jews, but he says the majority of Jews has to really be split in half, because half of them are using it for witchcraft and half of them are using it for incense. And therefore now the majority is used for a prohibited item and only a minority is being used for the scent. And in the case where the majority is not using it for fragrance, we does not recite a blessing. Similarly, Rabbi Chia Bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one who walks on Shabbat, even Tiberius, or at the conclusion of Shabbat in Sippori, and smell the scent of incense, may not recite a blessing, as the presumption is that it was intended to perfume garments. So it seems that I was wrong before. Using the incense to perfume your garments is just like dishwashing detergent. Sorry, not dishwashing detergent, laundry detergent. And its intention is to take away the bad smell that's in the clothes, and therefore it is not made for its scent. It's made for removing the smell from the clothing, and therefore you cannot recite a blessing on it. On a related note, the Gemara cites the following. The sages taught in a Brisa one who was walking in the marketplace of idolaters and willingly smelled the incense wafting there, he is a sinner, as he should not have the intention to smell this incense that is coming from idol worship. On to
How does
page
if one is
53b.
walking in the marketplace, how does one avoid smelling what's in the air?
I was just going to ask that.
It's a very good question, but first I need to tell you a story. There was once a pauper, and he would walk to the synagogue, and every day on his way to the synagogue, he would stop by the butcher, and he would come inside the store and smell the incredible smell of the fresh pastrami, and it would fill his soul, and then he would walk on to the synagogue and go about his day. And one day the butcher got mad at him and said, "Enough is enough. You must pay me for smelling my pastrami." And the man said, "I'm not eating your pastrami. Am I taking anything from you? No, you cannot charge me for the scent of your pastrami." And so they came to the rabbi, and the pauper said his side of the story, and the butcher said his side of the story. And the rabbi said, "I see, give me 10 coins." And so the pauper says, "But rabbi," and then he remembered that he's standing in front of the rabbi. So he takes out his 10 coins and he gives it to the rabbi. The rabbi takes the 10 coins and puts it in a paper bag and comes over to the butcher and shakes the paper bag, making the coins jingle in his ear, and said, "He smelled your pastrami. You can hear the clanging of his coins." That one fell a little flat. So yes, you cannot decide what's in the air or not in the air, and we're not asking anyone to walk around with a gas mask. However, what we are saying is there's walking by and noticing a smell, and then there's enjoying the smell of the fresh pastrami. So if we look carefully back in the how do we get back over here? Here. If we look carefully at the wording,
Yeah, but it
and
said that
willingly smelled, sorry?
it said that smelling it, he's a sinner. But like Zalman just said, if you're not going out of your way to smell something like the pastrami, if it just happens to be wafting in the air as you're walking by, how does that make you a sinner?
Oh, so that does not make you a sinner. If you're willingly smelling, if you're like smelling it and breathing it in and enjoying the smell, then that is what makes you a sinner. But if you're walking by and you happen to smell it, you keep walking, then that's it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
And we're going to learn also later that if a person reaps enjoyment from the smell of the perfume of a woman who is not his wife, is also considered a sinner. And you can ask the same question there, and the answer is that we're talking about a an enjoyment that is a meditated enjoyment and not just walking by and happening to smell. We learned in the Mishnah, you cannot recite the blessing over the candle unless you have benefit from its light. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, derives benefit does not mean that the person reciting the blessing must actually derive benefit from the light of the candle. Rather, as long as if one were to stand close to the candle, he could have utilized its light. Meaning, if the fire is big enough that it is usable, then you are allowed to make a blessing over it, even if now you are standing at a distance. So it has to be a usable light. The Gemara raises an objection from it to Sefta, one who had a candle hidden in his lap, or placed in an opaque lamp, or if he saw a flame and did not utilize its light, or if he utilized its light but did not see the flame, he may not recite a blessing until he both sees the flame and utilizes its light. So first we have to understand what exactly does this statement mean, because it sounds a little strange. The Gemara first clarifies the content of the Tosefta itself. Granted, a case where one utilizes the light but does not see the flame can be found if the flame is around the corner. So it's illuminating the area but hidden from your view. That way you can use the light of the candle without seeing the candle. But how could it be a case where you could see the flame but you cannot utilize its light? Is it that not referring to a case where a person is distant and you can see the flame, but you're just too far from it, so you can't use it? And this Tosefta says that that is not good enough. You have to actually utilize the flame. Merely having the potential to utilize it would not be sufficient. And the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case where the flame is gradually dimming. So you could see the flame, but you're unable to utilize its light because the flame is too small. The sages taught in a brisa one may recite a blessing over smoldering coals, just as he does over a candle. However, over dimming coals, one may not recite a blessing. The Gemara asks, what is the circumstances of a smoldering coal? What's the difference between dimming coals and smoldering coals? Rav Chisda said smoldering coals are coals that if you place a wood chip among them, it will go on fire itself without having to fan the flame. So if they're red hot coals, then that's good enough. But once they're already getting dim, then that's not good enough. With regard to the wording of the brisa, the Gemara has a question. Did the brisa say oimamos with the aleph or oimamos with an ayin? So we have a resolution. As Rav Chisda bar Abdimi said, the correct version is oimamos with an ayin. As it is said, the cedars of the garden of God could not dim it. And over there, the word dim is spelled with an ayin. With regard to the question of whether one must actually benefit from the light's flame in order to recite a blessing, Rava said when the Mishnah said benefit, it meant that he must actually derive benefit from the light, which means that everything we've said so far about making a blessing from a distance or seeing the town and making a blessing on the lights over there would not be good enough. And now the question asks, how bright does that light need to be? How close do you need to be? The Gemara asks, and how adjacent must one be in order to consider to have derived benefit from the flame? Ulla said, so that he can distinguish between two different coins, an isar and a pundion. Like if you could tell which one's a quarter and which one's a dime and a nickel, I don't know. 1 second, I just need to tell this guy to call me in 15 minutes. I apologize. Or, you know what, a $10 bill and a $5 bill. And Chizkiah said, if you could tell the difference between the weights that are used in Tiberias and the weight of used in Sapori, which are slightly different. So that's how much light you have to have. The Gemara relates that the Amoraim conducted themselves in accordance with their above stated opinions. At the conclusion of Shabbat, Rav Yehuda would recite a blessing over the light of the house of Ada the servant, which was far from his house. Rava would recite a blessing over the light of house of Guria bar Chama, which was adjacent to his house. And Abaya would recite a blessing over the light of the house of Bar Avuha. I don't know who that is. So we see over here that the different opinions were actually both used in practice. Rabbi Yehuda would recite a blessing over the light which was far away that he couldn't use it, but it was a usable light. And Abaya would recite a blessing over the light of his next door neighbor. And Rava would recite a blessing over the light of his next door neighbor, which he was able to use. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, a general halachic principle: one need not seek out light at the conclusion of Shabbat in the manner that one seeks out other mitzvahs. Right? There is an obligation to put on tefillin. We have to try and put on tefillin. We have an obligation to light Shabbat candles. We have to try and go and do our best to make sure that we have Shabbat candles. Same thing with matzah for Passover. But this light on Saturday night is not as strict. If no flame is available over which to recite a blessing, it does not prevent one from reciting Havdalah. And Rav Zera said, initially, I used to go and seek out light. And once I heard this halacha that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, I did not start seeking out light. However, if a candle happens to become available to me, I recite a blessing over it. That concludes our discussion regarding Havdalah. Now we're going back to the continuation of the arguments between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So we were talking all about the mealtime arguments, and part of the mealtime arguments got into arguments about if your meal finishes at the end of Shabbat, when do you say Havdalah? So we got into a long discussion about Havdalah. Now we are going to go back to the end of the meal. What happens if you finished eating and you forgot, you left without saying a blessing? Beis Shammai say you have to go back to the place where you ate and then recite the blessing. Beis Hillel said that it is unnecessary. You can recite the blessing at wherever you remembered that you forgot to make the blessing. So you got home and now you remembered that in the restaurant you forgot to make a blessing. You make a blessing at home. Beis Shammai will say, no, you have to drive back to the hospital. Not the hospital, the restaurant. I was just remembering a story when I once transported someone to a hospital and I forgot to get we have to get a signature from the nurse on staff to confirm that we transferred care to them. And there was one time that I transported and I forgot to get that signature. And so I had to go back to the hospital. I had to drive back to the hospital to get a signature from the nurse. And since then, thank God, I have remembered. Rav Zvid say, and some say that it was Rav Dimi bar Abba who said, this dispute is only with regard to a case when he forgot to say the blessing. But if he didn't forget, he intentionally left, everyone agrees that he must return to the place where he ate and recite the blessing there. The Gemara asks, what do you mean? This is obvious. We learned in the Mishnah, if a person forgot and went away from the table. The Mishnah didn't say if a person got up and said, I'm not doing the blessing here, I'm going to leave. The Gemara explains, no, you might have thought that the same is true, that Beis Hillel permit one to recite a blessing without returning to the place where he ate, even in a case where he willfully did not recite a blessing. And that which was taught and forgot is to convey the far-reaching nature of the opinion of Beis Shammai, who require him to return to the place where he ate, even if he forgot. And Rav Zvid teaches us that there is no disagreement in that case. Therefore, we need to learn that the argument was in a case where a person forgot, and if a person intentionally went away from the table without blessing, he would have to go back to the table. It was taught in a brisa that Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, according to your statement, one who ate atop the Temple Mount, God's chosen place of residence, and he was involved in all the temple ideas and temple things. It's a very holy place. And he forgot it. He came down without reciting a blessing. Must he return to the top of the Temple Mount, God's chosen place of residence, to recite the blessing? Well, he's going back all the way back into the holy sanctuary of the Lord. Wouldn't it make more sense and be preferable that he went in, he did his thing, and he's out now? Let him continue with the rest of his day. Beis Shammai said to Beis Hillel, why not? According to your statement, if a person forgot their purse atop the Temple Mount, God's chosen place of residence, would he not ascend to retrieve it? If one ascends in deference to his own needs, all the more so should he ascend in deference to heaven. Okay, you guys ready for a crazy story? Okay. It's a story, coincidence, but coincidence with a lesson. The Gemara relates there were these two students who ate and did not recite a blessing. One of them did so unwittingly, and in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, he was strict with himself, and even though he had forgotten, he returned where he ate, and he found a purse full of gold. One of them did so intentionally, and in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, albeit in circumstances where they agree with Beis Shammai, he did not return. He intentionally went away from the table, and he did not return. And does anybody know what happened to him next? You can look inside. What happened to him?
I ate them.
He got eaten by a lion. Pretty harsh. Ready for another crazy story?
Mhm.
The Gemara relates further. Rabba Bar Chana was once traveling with a caravan. He ate, and he forgot and did not recite a blessing. He said to himself, "What shall I do?" Right? So in those days, it was not safe to travel by yourself in the desert, so they would go with caravans. So he's with the caravan, and they ate lunch, and then he was talking with someone, and he forgot he didn't recite his after blessing, and they continued walking. So he said to himself, "What shall I do? If I say to them, I forgot to recite my blessing, they will tell me, recite a blessing here. Wherever you recite a blessing, you're reciting a blessing to God." So he said, "It is better that I say to them, I forgot my golden dove, and then they will wait for me while I retrieve it." He said to them, "Wait for me, I forgot my golden dove." And he went and recited a blessing, and he found over there a golden dove. Beautiful story. The Gemara asks, what is different about a dove that he specifically said that was the object that he forgot? And the Gemara answers, because the community of Israel is likened to a dove, as it is written in Psalms, the wings of a dove covered in silver, and its pinions with the shimmer of gold. The Gemara explains the parable, just as a dove is saved by its enemies only by its wings, so too Israel is saved only by the merit of the mitzvahs. Okay. Until when are you able to recite your after blessing of your food, and at what point is it too late? We learned in the Mishnah, until when does he recite the blessing? Until the food is digested in his intestines. The Gemara asks, what is the duration of digestion? Rabbi Yochanan said, as long as he is not yet hungry again. And Reish Lakish said, so long as he is still thirsty due to his eating. Rav Yemar bar Shalamya said to Mar Zutra, and some say that it was Rav Yemar bar Shezavi who said to Mar Zutra. Did Reish Lakish say that? That it's as long as he's still thirsty? Didn't Rav Ami quote Reish Lakish as having said, what is the duration of digestion? As long as it takes to walk 4 mil, which is about 72 minutes? The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. Here where Reish Lakish said the duration is as long as it takes to walk 4 mil is in a case where he ate a big meal. And here where he said it's as long as he remains thirsty is if he only ate a little meal. So a big meal takes 72 minutes to digest, and a small meal is less than that. Okay, next week we will continue our discussion all about wine. And for tomorrow, let me pull this up. Okay, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Dayenu. More than just a song, the beloved Passover song is far richer and deeper than it sounds. So come join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a deep dive and discussion into the song of Dayenu. Zalman, I received your Seder sign up. Looking forward to see you. I didn't look to see if you signed up for Chaim as well.
I didn't. No.
You didn't. Okay, so Chaim, I'm looking forward to your submission as well as Brett. Looking forward for your Seder RSVP. Wishing you all a wonderful day, a happy day, a healthy day. Thank you, Chaim, for joining us. Thank you, Zalman, for joining us. Thank you, Bela Esther, for joining us as we continue the discussions about Havdalah and about reciting the blessing of grace after meals.
Michael said that he didn't get an email about Purim.
Did he send me his information?
He gave it to you on Friday.
Oh yeah, that's because I didn't yet send out another email. You know what? Okay, I'll send him the link. I'll
Okay.
text it to him. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Philip?
And Zaman and Chaim also, again, thank you for helping make the minion for Kevin.
Oh, no problem. It's our pleasure.
Take care.